May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, and our freedom. Amen. When I went away to college, my thinking had been formed by a purity code interpretation of the entire Bible and of life. As you know, there are different sections in the Hebrew Bible: prophetic sections, poetic sections, historic sections. There's also a purity code section, delineates between what is clean and unclean. And one direction in which these regulations go is to delineate for Jews what is kosher and what is not. Now, every good thing can be misused and abused, especially by religion. And I had caught, as much as I had been taught, that this kind of purity code thinking applied to people as well as to foods and actions. That not only were there unclean foods and unclean actions, there were unclean persons and groups of people as well. Now, when college does its job, it is supposed to challenge absolutely every category you have. Genuine education is supposed to equip one to engage in critical thinking about absolutely everything. Parenthetically, as my years as a college dean of students before I became an Episcopal priest, I frequently received complaints from parents complaining about how Mercer University, where I was dean of students and campus minister, was destroying the faith of their children. Some of the toughest conversations I had with those parents was to inform them that we were doing our job if our students, their children, were dismantling the belief system they had inherited. Because you see, I implored with those scared and angry parents, if these students didn't dismantle what they had inherited, they would not know how to create a new belief system that could withstand all the changes of life and go through an evolutionary system and process of becoming forever strong. I was defending the strategic and intentional disorientation of belief systems in order to reorder a stronger, more pliable, and durable belief system. I believe that all of us are constantly going through this primal evolutionary process of order, disorder, and reorder, or orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. Only much later did I realize that the passion with which I was defending this intentional strategy was actually what had given me oxygen when I didn't even know I was suffocating. When you're trapped in racism or bigotry or either or thinking, sometimes you don't even know you need some oxygen. I had come to college with a rigidly intact purity code, clean versus unclean, sacred versus profane set of judgments about all of life. And in college, my exposure to a world outside the cushioned, protected, unchallenged, black and white either-or world I lived in was significantly challenged by the presence of fellow students and teachers who were living in a completely alternative universe than I was in. A place where race and sexual orientation in particular were no longer seen with those clean versus unclean lenses. I became so disoriented. I did the only thing I knew to do, and that was to reread the Bible, but this time on my terms. Now, it may seem very weird to many of you that the Bible is where I took my disorientation. But you see, I had no sense that seeking counseling or therapy could be an option for me. In my ordered way of seeing things, counseling was unclean. In this way of thinking, anything that was considered weak, like seeking help from a therapist, was seen as unclean. And I certainly couldn't return to the preacher types who had given me this narrative in the first place. They had given me that narrative that was no longer working for me, and I was no longer buying it. And certainly in my fantasy, if I'd gone to my friends, they would have laughed at me. So feeling alone, isolated, scared, disoriented, I reached for this precious graduation gift that sweet Ms. Marjorie Neesmith had given me just a month earlier. The J.B. Phillips translation of the New Testament. And I read that puppy cover to cover, just in a matter of days, out of desperation. And my eyes fell across this morning's first lesson from the 5th book in the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, where Peter, the disciple, had begun to associate with those who were considered unclean people, not kosher people, those who were not his kind. And the more conservative and bigoted colleagues in his community of Jesus' followers, yes, Christianity has had bigoted and conservative members in it, started challenging him about what was going on. Give us an account. They were still insisting that the male converts to Christianity had to undergo Jewish rituals of circumcision before they could ever be baptized. And Peter was leaving that old orientation behind. He was suffocating. And he shared with them that he had had this vision in which the voice of God had said to Peter, after lowering the sheet of all creation in front of him in his vision, and he heard the voice of God say to Peter, "Do not call profane what God has created clean." I read on in that Bible, and I'll never forget the moment. I can see myself right now in that little dormitory room where I read the following words in the book of Romans, chapter 14, verse 14. I'll never forget it. For those of you who are new to the Bible, that's the 6th book in the New Testament. Now we've gone from Peter testifying to Paul testifying, and he writes the following: "I am convinced, and I say this as in the presence of Christ himself, that nothing is intrinsically unholy or unclean." What? Nothing is intrinsically holy or unclean? Y'all, everything in my soul, heart, thinking, and behavior all of a sudden experienced a cosmic click. All the tumblers of the lock fell into place, allowing me to walk out of the prison cell of sacred versus profane thinking. Everything lined up. My cognitive dissonance went away. I had become initiated into Jesus' perspective about his table fellowship, which got him into constant trouble because he ate, you all remember from the scriptures, he loved to eat with whores and sinners and wine-bibbers. That's what the Bible says. And that's what he was constantly criticized for. All of a sudden, I realized what Jesus had lived in his life, and that is associating with people who are not your kind is the point. Getting outside your tribe is the point. Associating with tax collectors and sinners is the point. And if you and I don't learn how to do that, then we are limited in becoming aware of the mind of Christ that wants us to be more and more and more aware. Remember the 4 basic things that all global religions teach: show up, pay attention, tell the truth, and don't be attached to the results. Well, you could add, make sure compassion is central, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and you cannot live to the cosmic view of things unless you die to your egocentric view of things, but let's go back to paying attention. Paying attention to the mind of Christ, which means the mind of God, loving all things and seeing that nothing is profane or intrinsically unclean. That mind of Christ and paying attention to it and being aware of it is absolutely central to living the kind of radicality, the radically inclusive life that Jesus lived. Now, that's the theological part of the sermon. I want to connect the dots between that night when I was a little hayseed, redneck, 18-year-old, white, racist homophobe with the doors locked for fear of the fundamentalists, reading a graduation gift, the J.B. Phillips translation of the New Testament, with my jaw dropped literally open, that the Bible, yes, the B-I-B-L-E, now that's the book for me, as I had sung as a little kid. It had broken through the locked doors of fear and had just told me that nothing is intrinsically unclean. Now, let me tell you how that's connected with four things. One, at the last vestry meeting, the vestry passed a comprehensive and beautifully crafted resolution pledging that this institution, this faith community, this movement of Jesus at 132 North Euclid is going to do everything in its power to dismantle racism and all other interlocking oppressions. This resolution, if it does its work in the hearts and minds and education and formation and policies of all saints people, will cause sacred discomfort in the spirit of the order, disorder, reorder process that is absolutely necessary for the flourishing of every human being in the human family. The mystery of faith that we say at this table every Sunday, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, is actually called the Paschal mystery of a very universal process of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. That process is necessary about absolutely every part of your life, including your life about race. We have that resolution on the website of All Saints, and it's also copies at the action table today. Also, I have asked that an executive summary written by our own Jeremy Langell just in the last 4 days of one of the most important academic papers I've ever read called White Fragility. That's available. It will teach us, remind us, particularly us white people, that part of racism is that we, in our privilege, can avoid discomfort when it comes to talking about race. And our sisters and brothers who are people of color can never avoid our whiteness and its privilege and the racism in our society. They never can walk away from it, and we white folks can simply say, sorry, I'm not dealing with that today. Consequently, that leaves our multicultural muscles unexercised and atrophying and results in our having white fragility. And if you and I are going to go through order, disorder, and reorder and lead our nation and the world in the same thing, you and I have got to put an end to our white fragility. So pick up that article. And there also are articles, copies of a timeless article called Is Reconciliation Possible?, which was presented to the House of Bishops by our own multiculturalism teacher, Dr. Valerie Batts. And that article lays out the model for transforming individuals and systems in recognizing and celebrating difference rather than seeing difference as unclean or unholy, as some presidential candidates think. Now, I'm telling you all this with great passion this morning Because next month, I'm going yonder unto Birmingham to live. I'm going to be a card-carrying, pledge-paying member of the All Saints diaspora. And I'm going to be counting on you people of All Saints Church to be as pioneeringly radical as you can possibly be when it comes to all matters, especially matters of racism and modern isms and multiculturalism. I am paying my pledge from Alabama so that you can be working Jesus' agenda of radical inclusion, so that you will be a resource for the inclusification and the pioneerifying of the whole world. Yesterday was William Shakespeare's birthday, 400th birthday, and I read in the New York Times the day before that he added to the English language 1,700 new words. And I am so far behind him in making my contribution to changing the English language. Point number 2. Please, 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 get out there and keep us in the diaspora tuned in and educated about the frontier of inclusion, peace, and justice. For instance, last week during my peer supervision group of 12 persons meeting for a day and a half, All Saints was doing its work on me. There was a relatively new member of our circle who is transgender. He prefers to be referred to as he and him and his. I did pretty well, although I have to confess that at one point I had to apologize when I made the mistake of referring to him as her. We are not going to do this transgender inclusion thing perfectly without making some mistakes. But Jesus wants us to be radically inclusive. And even my transgender friend who was sitting next to me told me that he makes mistakes. Because a new generation of transgender members of the human family, now he is in his 40s, here come these new transgender sisters and brothers in their teens and in their 20s who prefer to respectfully acknowledge that within them there is no binary gendered identity of male versus female, and so they prefer to be referred to as they and them. So sexual identity is much more complicatedly glorious than just he versus her, they are teaching us. Number 3, third connection. Yesterday morning, after I blew out my voice on Friday night laughing at the most clever and irreverent roast, filled up the room laughing at my foibles and idiosyncrasies. Absolutely the best ever roast in the history of laughter and comedy. I, like a fool, got up early and got on a plane to fly up to Oakland to celebrate my last wedding as your rector. It was Morgan Muir's wedding to Mike Callahan Dudley. The reason I did it was because Morgan was 10 years old when I arrived 21 years ago. She grew up in this place. When she applied for college, her college application essay was on Archbishop Tutu's theology and philosophy of Ubuntu that she had heard preached in this pulpit, that we need one another in order to be who we are. So I had to go to her wedding. Now her husband, is a bit allergic to church settings. So rather than do a royal wedding here in the church house, they had rented a wedding venue on the bay that used to be a Ford automobile factory And they turned this gigantic industrial space into a church in the round with 5 concentric circles of chairs, with the bride and groom and me on the platform in the middle. They brought in an African American gospel choir singing, bringing us to church, as Brother Prince used to say and do. I ask all the couples I marry to compose the liturgy from a variety of sources I give them. And Morgan and Mike did that, and they even suggested things that I say in my homily. They had a John Muir reading about nature on this Earth Day weekend, and a Desmond Tutu passage about how we are all called to like our enemies, not to like our enemies, but to love our enemies. And in the dearly beloved speech that I gave at the beginning of the wedding, they instructed me to say the following. Now, Morgan and Mike are getting married, understanding their white, straight privilege. That not everybody in the world who finds the love of their life can get married. And they wanted me to call out LGBTQ brothers and sisters who throughout the world can't get married. And they said, we just want to have a moment of silence for that. That's a kid being raised in this place on the radically inclusive diet of Jesus, going out into the world. Finally, and I know I have to wrap this up. Next Sunday, we're going to worship in the street. It's going to be a love bath. Over the top. But today and right now is my last sermon in this physical pulpit as rector after 21 years. Because I finally went to the new members class this year. Amazing what you can learn in new members class. On the tour of the church, I found out and discovered that this pulpit is an octagon. 8-sided things are holy in all of the world's religions. The Eightfold Path, Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Baha'i, in all of the classical thinking. Some of the greatest literature in the history of literature has 8 in the title. I wrote a book called 8 Habits of Love. Yep. In Christianity, 8 is the symbol of completion, the symbol of resurrection. It's associated with joy. There are 8 Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. Christ rose from the dead on the 8th day after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Baptismal fonts, many of them are shaped as an 8-pointed octagon. This, for me, has been a call to proclaim the healing, transformation, wholeness, regeneration, and completeness and new life that love can create in somebody's life. God says in the Revelation passage today, I'm making a new heaven and a new earth. The old order has gone. Prepare for disorientation and reorientation. Let God's redemptive energies begin with you, all saints. I'll be praying and pledging and giving from Birmingham so that your radical, audacious, inclusive agenda will help me let God's redemptive love begin in me. Thank you and amen.